In 1914, Europe was a hub of technological development, culture, and fashion. Early automobiles shared cobblestones with horse-drawn carriages in massive city squares. Yet beneath this civilized surface, imperial governments were calculating how to absorb their neighbors' territory. Germany wanted land that belonged to France, and France wanted to reclaim territory taken by Germany. Meanwhile, Britain grew increasingly anxious as the German Empire constructed a massive, modern navy to challenge British dominance at sea. The public and the political elite viewed military conflict through an antiquated lens. War was seen as a noble endeavor, a glorious aristocratic game that would be resolved with a few decisive cavalry charges and a treaty before Christmas. They had completely industrialized their military weapons, but they maintained the diplomatic and tactical mentalities of the 19th century. This combination of modern industrial power and a romanticized view of conduct created a continent that was prepared to destroy itself. The catalyst for the conflict began with a failed assassination attempt. Archduke Franz Ferdinand paraded through the streets of Sarajevo, where assassins threw explosives. They missed the Archduke, blowing up the trailing officers instead. Rather than fleeing the city, the Archduke decided to visit the injured men in the hospital. On the way, his driver took a wrong turn, stalled the engine, and came to a stop directly beside one of the failed assassins, who suddenly raised a pistol and fired. Austria-Hungary immediately blamed the Serbian government for the assassination. Before retaliating, they secured a guarantee of military support from their ally, Germany. With German backing, Austria-Hungary delivered a list of impossible demands to Serbia. When the Serbs refused to comply, Austria-Hungary declared war. This map illustrates the web of treaties governing the continent. Serbia's treaties bound Russia to intervene, requiring France to also mobilize. Treaties dictated automatic military responses, forcing millions of men across multiple borders to march toward the front. A single wrong turn in Sarajevo had triggered a localized dispute, which the mechanical rigidity of European alliances converted into a continent-wide trap. Germany knew that fighting Russia in the east and France in the west simultaneously would split their forces. Their military command devised a strict timetable. They would defeat France quickly while the Russian army was still gathering its troops. Looking at this invasion map, you can see the flaw in Germany's logic. France had heavily fortified its shared border with Germany. To maintain their schedule, the German army decided to bypass these defenses by cutting directly through neutral Belgium. The Germans expected Belgium to stand aside. Instead, the Belgian army fought back, slowing the invasion and disrupting the German timetable. The invasion of a neutral nation carried political consequences. Watching Belgium get trampled forced Britain to abandon its hesitation and officially declare war, sending hundreds of thousands of British soldiers across the Channel. As the Germans pushed through Belgium, reports of atrocities against civilians reached the press. Paired with uniforms featuring sharp spikes and skull motifs, the German army handed the Allies a significant propaganda advantage on the global stage. By prioritizing a rigid invasion schedule over diplomacy, German command expanded the battlefield and ensured they would fight the prolonged, multi-front war they had tried to avoid. While Germany was struggling in Belgium, the French military marched toward the border using outdated tactics. They grouped their men in tight, slow-moving columns across open countryside. The French infantry marched out in bright blue coats and vibrant red trousers. These colorful uniforms made the soldiers highly visible against the natural landscape. The Germans spotted these columns from miles away, using long-range artillery to tear the formations apart before they could even fire their rifles. The French were forced into a retreat toward Paris. But as the German army overextended its supply lines to pursue them, the French commander ordered his men to stop, opening a gap between the advancing German armies. To avoid being flanked and destroyed, the Germans halted their advance and pulled back. The industrial efficiency of modern artillery had broken the momentum of the traditional infantry charge. Caught in the open fields and exposed to high volumes of machine gun and artillery fire, soldiers on both sides began frantically digging into the dirt for cover. Each army tried to march north to outflank the other's defensive line, digging new ditches every time they clashed, only to reach a stalemate and move further north again. Looking at this map, you can track how this sequence of failed maneuvers created a continuous line of parallel trenches, stretching from the North Sea coast down to the Swiss border. The war of movement had effectively stopped. The front was no longer a series of battlefields, but a continuous line of earthworks where traditional strategy was replaced by endurance. Between these opposing trench systems lay no man's land, a stretch of mud, shattered trees, and thick coils of barbed wire that belonged to neither army. To weaken the enemy, one side would fire hundreds of thousands of explosive shells into the opposing trench. These bombardments sometimes lasted for days, leaving the men trapped below, shell-shocked and buried in collapsing dirt. When the artillery stopped, soldiers were ordered over the top. They crawled out of the earth and sprinted across the mud, running directly into the crossfire of defensive machine guns. The general sent wave after wave of men into this fire. They traded months of fighting and thousands of lives just to gain a few meters of ground. When they weren't charging, the soldiers lived in physical squalor. They ate and slept, surrounded by mud that could swallow a man whole, poisoned water, and rampant disease. The empires of 1914 began the year with dreams of a short, glorious conflict, but they ended it buried in a landscape of mud and wire that they could no longer control. The era of sweeping cavalry charges and rapid territorial conquest was dead and buried. By the brutal winter of 1914, the Western Front had solidified into a massive, static scar across Europe. Taking land no longer mattered. With both sides heavily entrenched, the objective shifted to pure attrition. Victory simply meant mathematically exhausting the enemy's resources before your own ran out. Armies were permanently trapped in the earth. Men lived stuck in place for months, standing knee-deep in freezing water and mud, waiting for an artillery shell with their name on it. To speed up the exhaustion, the British Navy established a naval blockade. They severed Germany's import lines, ensuring food and basic materials no longer reached the civilian population. It became a brutal waiting game. Both sides fed millions of men from their overseas dominions directly into the trenches, waiting to see which empire's economy and morale would fracture first. Trapped in the European deadlock, the warring empires desperately looked for a backdoor to victory, dragging the rest of the world into the fight. The Allies immediately targeted Germany's overseas territories, launching massive, chaotic campaigns across the African continent. Local populations were drafted into proxy wars they had no stake in. Native Africans were conscripted as soldiers and supply carriers by both sides, dying in huge numbers far from the European trenches. The conflict then ignited the Middle East. The Ottoman Empire allied with the Central Powers, launching sprawling campaigns that stretched from the freezing peaks of the Caucasus Mountains down to the blazing deserts of the Suez Canal. Hoping to knock the Ottomans out quickly, the Allies attempted a massive amphibious assault at Gallipoli, but they failed to break the lines, and the landing devolved into yet another grueling, static trench war. To bypass the gridlock, the British turned to internal sabotage. They supplied and encouraged local Arab tribes to wage mobile desert warfare, successfully tearing apart Ottoman supply lines from the inside out. Millions of colonial subjects bled, starved, and died across these new frontiers. Yet none of these sprawling global campaigns managed to shift the balance of power back in Europe. Before the conflict, nations had agreed to specific rules of engagement: no chemical weapons, no targeting civilians. Out of pure desperation to break the stalemate, the warring empires consciously chose to tear up those agreements. Death started falling from the sky. massive airships commenced bombing raids directly over British cities, bringing the terror of the war to sleeping civilians. At sea, German submarines sank civilian ships to sever Allied supply chains. The destruction of ocean liners, including the Lusitania, killed hundreds of non-combatants, including over 100 Americans. On the ground, armies deployed horrific chemical agents. Heavy gas was rolled across no man's land to choke out the men who couldn't escape their dugouts. By the Battle of the Somme, the British rolled out massive, heavily armored machines designed to physically crush the barbed wire and trenches beneath their treads. Targeting civilians and introducing terrifying new weapons didn't end the conflict. It merely increased the volume and speed of the slaughter. By 1917, sheer exhaustion took hold. Entire units of the French army began to mutiny, refusing to attack, while the German public starved under the relentless naval blockade. In a war of pure attrition, victory doesn't look like conquering a capital city. It looks like the enemy's society physically and psychologically fracturing from the pressure. That fracture happened first in Russia. Drained of food, exhausted of military supplies, and tired of massive casualties, the population flooded the streets of Petrograd in a total revolt. The Tsar was overthrown. Months later, the Bolsheviks seized power, and their immediate priority was to pull Russia completely out of the global conflict. With the eastern borders suddenly quiet, Germany possessed a terrifying, fleeting window of opportunity. They could now hurl every remaining soldier directly at the Western Front. But Germany made a fatal miscalculation. They sent a telegram encouraging Mexico to attack the United States to keep them distracted. British intelligence intercepted the message, handed it to the Americans, and forced their hand. The United States formally entered the war. They possessed a massive, untouched reservoir of wealth and manpower, and troops immediately shipped out across the Atlantic. Germany was on a ticking clock. They had to force France and the UK to surrender before the sheer volume of arriving Americans overwhelmed their own starving army. They launched one final, desperate spring offensive. The German army threw every last man into rapid, successive strikes against the Allied line. The Allies absorbed the hits. The line bent but held. As American numbers swelled, the Allies pushed back with an overwhelming counterattack. By spending the absolute last of their resources on a failed gamble, the Central Powers triggered their own systemic collapse. The dominoes fell fast. Bulgaria's military collapsed first, followed rapidly by the Ottomans, and then Austria-Hungary. Finally, on November 11, 1918, Germany surrendered. At the peace table, the victors dictated terms. Germany was forced to dismantle its military, accept complete guilt, and absorb a massive financial debt. Millions of lives were extinguished in the trenches, at sea, and across the colonies. Entire empires had dissolved, leaving behind a scarred globe and a deeply traumatized generation. The staggering horror of this conflict failed to teach a lasting lesson. It built the foundation for an even darker war 20 years later.